For this episode, we'll be talking to Mr. Veo Yap. He is a QA tester for a video game company. Uh, Today, we'll be talking with him about uh, video game development, what is present in the development of video games, and if stories are a focal point in the consideration in the development of games, and how do they craft games around that specific aspect of video game design. We'll also try to talk to him what makes video game gameplay or design elements unique in telling a story, and we'll finally talk to him about similarities and differences of same stories but in different mediums, especially in the medium of video games. I wanted to talk to Mr. Yap because I wanted to talk to someone who is an insider in the industry of making games. I wanted to compare what they do to what Mr. Valles talked about in the last episode of what makes a story a good story. I wanted to know if video game developers also follow those same rule sets and how they manage to execute it in the medium of video games. Hello, good morning. Um, I am with my new guest today, and so please, could you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Veo Yap, currently a QA tester at Amber Studios.
So could you tell us what that entails, being a QA tester?
Being QA tester means we test the games before it's finally shipped out to the public. So we make sure that it's actually playable, then and no bugs are encountered by the players who are going to be the audience of the game.
So so to start off, just a basic question. Would you consider video games a medium in which you could communicate a story with an audience?
Yes. Video games nowadays are more story centric as compared to video games of old. There's a focus on how to tell stories in different ways in video games. Uh, yeah, so it's a very effective form of storytelling nowadays.
Ah, I see, I see. So but before we continue on this whole exploration of storytelling in video games, would you have an idea on how video games are made, the process of making video games, are there central elements in designing them and so forth?
Yes. So the number one central element that you have to take into account is engaging mechanics in video games. Since video games are an interactive form of media, the audience must always be engaged while playing the game. If you don't have an engaging mechanic that's presented to the player, they might not uh, fully finish the game, or they might not be interested in understanding the story of the game.
All right. Um, so you mentioned that it is that game design is important in letting players understand the story of the game. So
Yes.
I take it that that's a central that's been already been taken into account when you're making these video games, like in the conceptual stage, the design stage, and so forth.
Yes. So stories are usually a part or a central element when designing a video game, because you can make a mechanic that's centered around the story. So without the story, the game is just a bunch of mechanics with no overarching plot or no compelling reason why you should play it.
Ah, so it is, you would argue, like the central element before you do other, like level design, sound design, and so and all that.
Yes.
So, if a story could be effectively told via the medium of video games, so like you said, could you have take us through a little bit more detailed process on how the designers go about like building a game around the story?
So in game design, you have to have a solid story first. So when trying to make a mechanic, you have to integrate it to the story. You can't just make a mechanic that's not part of the world or the story of the game, because it would make no sense when playing the game. You can't have a really grounded story with fantasy elements in it or fantasy mechanics.
All right. So, so these these video game so have you taken like these other elements of like visual communication like in movies or television shows, have you taken like uh pointers or points on how they tell stories and then integrated them into video game design?
For me, no. For me, video games are kind of doing their own thing since it's interactive. It's more enticing to the players to play their own story because they are no longer just an idle person just watching the story unfold. They are the ones playing the characters. They're taking part in the story, making the choices, making uh, what the story could be or what the story should be.
All right, I see. So so uh has this resulted, do you think, so you did mention that the players themselves have their own say, right, in how the story plays out or how their characters go about the world. So I take it that it becomes more immersive to a player to really that it's more immersive or more the players are more invested in the story.
Yes. So with in terms of video games, the main one of the main criterias of a video game is how immersive it can be. For example, a game like Shadow of Mordor,
Yes.
they integrated a mechanic called the Nemesis system.
Yes.
With the Nemesis system, each time you get killed by a NPC, uh, you forge a story with that NPC. So there's countless of stories that the player could be immersed in with different NPCs. So yes, video games should be can have the power to immerse a player or an audience into their story.
All right. So so next an argument that I've been long cooking or long advocating for is that uh video games have long been long been a device for storytelling. However, it hadn't before really captured like a sort of a level of sophistication because of technology, the limits of technology. Um, People still had to have a pretty deep suspension of disbelief for when they're telling stories. I would, for example, I would compare the two. Are you familiar with the Red Dead Redemption games?
Yes.
Yeah. So for like the first game versus the second game, um, the physics or the uh, the graphics are quite different from one another. So because of technological advances, there is now a like a more sophisticated way to tell a story or that that I guess really encapsulates realism and really a more grounded story. Would you agree to that? that technological progress has been a big factor in creating a more that in creating a more mainstream acceptance of video games as a storytelling device.
Yes. So technology is advances have helped storytelling in video games because comparing old video games, they're more linear. Like in Mario,
Yes,
you just have to save Princess Peach.
yes,
Comparing to games now, like Detroit Become Human, you have choices to make, which directly affects the outcome of the game or your story. In terms of uh, the cutscenes of stories nowadays, there used to be like loading times before in between cutscenes.
yes, yes.
Now you just from a cutscene you go directly into the gameplay, so you don't have to wait. So you're more immersed into the video game.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Also to that, ha- has has like has there been also a sort of a a learning of how to design levels or design worlds that would make playing in them or using gameplay elements within these worlds has that sort of like improved? Have lessons been learned? Is our games now like more well designed in order to cater to like a better or a more immersive storytelling experience?
Yes. So a great example of this is Watch Dogs Legion. So in that game, you get to play as anyone in London. So the player has the power to create his own story with anyone they choose.
Yes.
So they have different types of characters. They're just bases or classes of different archetypes. So they can just be immersed with this one player. They are fully invested in the choices, the emotions of the player. Then when they finish that, they can run through again with a different story or a different character that they wanted to play with.
I see, I see. So uh you would you agree that this medium um the medium of video games can be more immersive than, for example, watching a film or a television show. The stories, I mean, are they can people become more immersed or more invested in the stories told through video games?
For me, yes, it's more immersive to play a video game than to watch a movie. A good example of this is I played The Last of Us just recently, but I watched the show
Yeah,
first. So I'm more invested in the
yeah,
playing the video game than watching the HBO show. Because in the video game, I get to play as Joel. So
yeah.
I make the choices, I make the character's story. So I'm more invested in his story because in I am Joel in the video game. So uh I am not just a bystander watching the story unfold. I am the player that's uh making the story or creating the story.
Yeah. So yeah, because you really do feel really the consequences of your actions, right? Unlike if you're just
Yes.
a bystander, and then you're like more invested because you had to really go through something with those characters as
Yes.
Joel, right? Yeah, as compared to like just being watching their story unfold. You're like, oh, it's pretty sad, but I mean, you didn't really
Yeah.
go through stuff with them in
Yeah.
the
There is
show, right?
no investment when it comes to just watching movies comparing to video games.
However, would you say that when you watched the show as compared to playing the game, was it um I wouldn't say an inferior experience, but um if you put both in like a bubble, you still did enjoy watching the show, right?
Yes. It's just with the game I'm more invested
Yeah,
because it's more time. I've made these weapons, so if
yeah,
I break them, there's no more. I can't remake them.
yeah. But so I'm sorry. What I'm trying to get to is it uh there's still both enjoyable and unique experiences, right? In
Yes.
their own ways, watching a film versus watching playing the video game version of the same story. Um, so um, so with that, do you think that there are certain advantages or I'd like to delve deeper into what we were talking about, the immersion in the story in video games. Is there uh, a advantage in telling a story via a video game? Like you said, you get more. Well, like we were talking about, we were more invested in the side characters, but also, um, can you like flesh out a character better when you tell a story via a video game or versus like a movie or a TV show? Can video game players be really get to uh, know a character deeper than for like let's take the example of The Last of Us. Did you get to know Joel deeper in the game versus in the show?
For me, yes. For an advantage of video game for me is the interactivity of the world. So when you're playing the game, you're the ones going through the world,
Yes.
interacting with different people. So when playing Last of Us, me as Joel, I get to interact with player. So I'm not playing as me. I'm
Yeah.
playing as Joel. So I get to make choices on what I think Joel would do in that situation.
Um, on the opposite of that, did you feel that there was like something better that the show did than the game? Were there like a disadvantage when you tell a story via a game as compared to other forms of communication?
Uh, for me, the disadvantage of uh, telling a story in video game, it's not that linear. So there's a chance that players can get lost with what you're trying to tell. In
Ah,
terms
right.
of The Last of Us, it's more straightforward in the show
Yeah.
comparing to the video game where I had to explore parts of the world to get through or what to know what's happening in the world. With the show, it's being told to me, so it's kind of less uh, work for me to do. So I just have to watch and pay attention to the details of the show.
Ah, I understand. All right. So, so would you say that has have video games like reached a level of storytelling? I term it sophistication. That they could be sort of accepted by the mainstream to be on the same level as the public acceptance, for example, of movies or TV shows as a storytelling device.
For me, yes. So with the video game industry is a growing industry. So with that, more and more great stories are being told using video games, such as Red Dead Redemption 2,
Yes.
one of the best stories told in video games. Uh, you have games now that are being adapted into TV shows and movies, like Last of Us, The Witcher. Then you have older stories that could be translated into video games better, like God of War Ragnarok is translating Norse mythology.
Yeah.
Uh, the Assassin's Creed games are translating historical
Yeah.
stories into a more uh, digestible version of for younger audiences.
All right. That uh very interesting. Yeah, so I guess with that, I guess I already asked all of my questions. So thank you for uh spending some time with me with us and talking a little bit about video games. So with that, I hope again that you learned a lot. Again, I sure did. So in this episode, we were able to know that at least for Mr. Yap's experience, stories do form an integral part in the development of video games and therefore is very important in the enjoyment of the audience of video games because they are immersed in the story. So for next week, we'll be talking to someone from the audience themselves to get a glimpse on just what the effects of video games are in telling a story to the audience. So until then, see you guys.